When the case reached too high up. Chapter 1, The File on His Desk. Detective Marcus Webb had been with the Metropolitan Police Department for 19 years, and in all that time, he had learned to read a case before he even opened the folder. The weight of it, the way it landed on his desk, the expression on the face of whoever delivered it, these things told him more than the first page ever could. This one arrived on a Thursday morning in late September, carried by Lieutenant Garrison himself. That was the first sign. Garrison didn't deliver files personally. He had 3 assistants and a rotating cast of junior officers for that. But here he was, standing in Marcus's doorway, holding a manila folder that looked thin, too thin for whatever warranted his presence. "Webb," Garrison said, his voice flat, administrative. "Got something for you." Marcus looked up from his coffee, noting the time on the wall clock, 7:47 a.m. Early, even for Garrison. "What is it?" "Financial analyst. Found dead in his apartment Sunday night. Looks like suicide, but the sister's pushing back. Says he wasn't the type." Garrison placed the folder on Marcus's desk with deliberate care, as if it might break. "Just take a look. Rule it out properly so we can close it clean." Marcus pulled the folder closer but didn't open it yet. "Why me?" "Anderson handles most of the financial district cases. Anderson's tied up with that embezzlement thing. This shouldn't take long." Garrison was already turning to leave, which was the second sign. No eye contact. No waiting for questions. Just be thorough. Document everything. The door closed, and Marcus sat alone with the folder. Through his office window, he could see the morning shift filtering in, officers carrying paper cups of coffee, laughing about something, their voices muffled through the glass. Normal sounds. A normal Thursday. He opened the folder. The deceased was named Alan Pritchard, 34 years old, employed by Meridian Financial Group as a senior analyst. The photographs showed a neat apartment in the warehouse district, exposed brick, expensive furniture, everything arranged with careful precision. And then the body, Alan Pritchard slumped in his desk chair, head tilted back, a bottle of pills on the desk beside an empty glass. The preliminary report noted high levels of zolpidem and alcohol in his system. The scene suggested a man who had decided, calmly and methodically, to end his life on a Sunday evening while the city hummed outside his windows. But Marcus had learned not to trust scenes. Scenes could be arranged. He flipped through the pages. No note. That was notable. People who planned their deaths usually left something, an explanation, an apology, a final accusation. Alan Pritchard had left nothing but an immaculate apartment and a folder of financial documents spread across his desk, facing the chair where he died. Marcus looked at those documents in the photograph, trying to read the headers, but the crime scene camera's angle made them illegible. Just rows of numbers and corporate letterhead, the kind of material that would mean everything to someone like Pritchard and nothing to most people. The sister's statement was attached, Rachel Pritchard, 2 years older, living in Baltimore. She'd called it in when Alan missed their weekly phone call. She insisted he'd been anxious lately, yes, but not suicidal. He was close to something, she told the responding officer. He said he was close to understanding something big. That's not the talk of someone giving up. Marcus read that line again. Close to something. He picked up his phone and dialed the medical examiner's office. It rang 4 times before someone picked up. Forensics, Caldwell speaking. It's Webb. I've got a case, Alan Pritchard, brought in Sunday night. Can you send me the full autopsy report? There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. Pritchard, yeah, I remember that one. Report's already filed. Sent it up Tuesday. I need the detailed version. Anything that seemed off, even if it fit the suicide conclusion. Another pause, longer this time. Webb, that case is marked conclusive. Clean suicide. Why are you? Just send it over. Full report. All right. Give me an hour. Marcus hung up and looked at the folder again, at the photograph of Alan Pritchard's face. The man's expression was slack, empty, the way death emptied everyone. But his eyes were open, staring at something beyond the camera's frame, and Marcus found himself wondering what the last thing Alan Pritchard saw had been. His desk, probably. Those documents. Whatever truth he'd been close to understanding. Marcus stood and walked to his window. Outside, the city was waking fully now, traffic building, people hurrying toward their jobs, their routines, their carefully constructed lives. Somewhere in that city, someone knew why Alan Pritchard was dead. Someone knew what those documents meant. And Marcus Webb, after 19 years of learning to read the signs, had a feeling that finding out was going to cost him more than he wanted to pay. But he would look anyway. That was his job. That was who he'd always been. He returned to his desk, pulled out a fresh notepad, and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Then, in careful block letters, he wrote, Alan Pritchard, questions. The morning light slanted through his window, illuminating the thin folder that had started it all. Somewhere in the building, phones were ringing. Someone was laughing. Life continued. Marcus picked up his pen and began to write the first question. And with it, though he didn't know it yet, he began the journey toward the place where some questions aren't allowed to have answers. Chapter 2, The Documents That Didn't Fit. Marcus spent the rest of Thursday reviewing the forensic reports and conducting preliminary interviews. By Friday morning, he had spoken with Alan Pritchard's supervisor at Meridian Financial, 2 of his colleagues, and his building superintendent. Each conversation added small details but nothing that contradicted the suicide ruling. Alan had been quiet, professional, kept to himself. He worked late hours. He seemed stressed recently, but then again, everyone in finance seemed stressed. The autopsy report arrived Friday afternoon, and Marcus read it twice, searching for inconsistencies. Zolpidem concentration consistent with ingestion of 30 to 40 tablets. Alcohol level moderate, enough to potentiate the sedative effect. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication of restraint. Time of death estimated between 8 and 11 p.m. on Sunday. Everything aligned with a man who had decided to die and followed through methodically. Except for one detail buried in the toxicology notes, trace amounts of a different benzodiazepine in his system, one not prescribed to him. The ME had noted it but dismissed it as potentially from earlier in the week, concentrations too low to be significant. Marcus circled that paragraph 3 times. On Monday, he drove to Alan Pritchard's apartment. The building was one of those converted warehouses that developers loved, all exposed ductwork and polished concrete, the kind of place that cost $3,000 a month and felt cold no matter how much you heated it. The superintendent, a tired-looking man named Vincent, let him in without enthusiasm. Police already cleared the scene, Vincent said, unlocking the door to Unit 412. Family hasn't come for his stuff yet. I know. Just need another look. The apartment was exactly as the photographs had shown it, immaculate, expensive, empty of personality. Marcus walked through slowly, letting the space tell him its story. Kitchen spotless, dishes put away. Bedroom made with hospital corners. Bathroom organized like a pharmacy, every product lined up by height. This was a man who controlled what he could control. But the home office, that was different. Marcus stood in the doorway, studying the desk where Alan Pritchard had died. The chair had been removed, probably tagged as evidence, but everything else remained. The desk faced a window overlooking the street, and Marcus imagined sitting there, watching the city, working late into the night on whatever Alan had been working on. The documents from the crime scene photos were gone, collected as evidence, but Marcus could see the impressions they'd left on the desk's leather pad. He bent closer, trying to make out any details, but the impressions were too faint. He took photographs anyway. What struck him was the filing system. Alan had 3 filing cabinets in the office, all locked. Marcus had requested the keys through evidence, and now he used them, opening each drawer systematically. The first cabinet contained personal documents, taxes, insurance, lease agreements, all meticulously organized. The second held what appeared to be legitimate work files, quarterly reports and analysis summaries, everything properly labeled. The third cabinet was different. The folders here had no labels. Just dates, written in pencil on the tabs, spanning the last 8 months. Marcus pulled out the most recent one, dated 3 weeks before Alan's death, and opened it on the desk. Inside were photocopies, dozens of them. Bank statements, transfer records, corporate filings, all marked with sticky notes in Alan's precise handwriting. Numbers circled, arrows drawn between entries, question marks scattered throughout. Marcus wasn't a financial expert, but even he could see the pattern Alan had been tracking, money moving through a complex web of accounts, amounts that seemed to split and merge and disappear into offshore designations. And names. Some redacted in the original documents, but Alan had written them in: Harrison, Kellerman, Voss, Chen. Marcus didn't recognize them, but the way Alan had underlined certain ones suggested significance. One name appeared more than others, always circled twice: Meridian Capital Partners. Marcus photographed every page, working methodically. The folder represented hundreds of hours of work, the kind of obsessive documentation that suggested Alan Pritchard hadn't been preparing to die, he'd been preparing to prove something. In the back of the folder, Marcus found a memory drive taped to the inside cover. Small, black, unremarkable. He held it up to the window light, turning it slowly. This hadn't been listed in the evidence log. Either the initial investigators had missed it, or Alan had hidden it well enough that only someone looking for this kind of thing would find it. Marcus pocketed the drive. He spent another hour searching the apartment, looking for anything else the initial sweep might have missed. In the bedroom closet, behind a stack of shoe boxes, he found a burner phone. Cheap, prepaid, the kind you bought at convenience stores. It was turned off, but when Marcus powered it on, it showed a call log with a single number, called repeatedly over the past month. The last call had been made Saturday night, the evening before Alan's death. Marcus photographed the number, then turned the phone off and pocketed it alongside the memory drive. As he was leaving, he paused in the doorway of the office, looking back at the desk, the window, the filing cabinets with their careful secrets. Alan Pritchard had sat here, night after night, following some thread that had led him to a conclusion. A conclusion that might have killed him. In his car, Marcus sat with the evidence he wasn't supposed to have, feeling the weight of the small devices in his pocket. This was the moment where he should log everything properly, follow protocol, keep the chain of evidence intact. Instead, he started the car and drove back to the station, the memory drive and burner phone still in his jacket. Some instinct, the same one that had kept him alive in 19 years of police work, told him that the moment he logged these items, they would disappear into administrative channels and never resurface. And whatever Alan Pritchard had died knowing would disappear with them. The afternoon sun was setting behind the city's skyline as Marcus pulled into the parking garage, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Beautiful and indifferent, the way the city always was. He had questions now. Real questions. The kind that usually led to answers. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered what his instincts already knew: some questions, once asked, couldn't be unasked. And some answers changed everything that came after. Marcus Webb locked his car and walked toward the station entrance, carrying secrets in his pocket that didn't belong to him yet. Chapter 3, The Names Behind the Numbers. Marcus didn't go home that night. Instead, he stayed late at the station, waiting until the building grew quiet and the evening shift settled into their routines. At 9 p.m., when most of the detectives had left and only the patrol officers remained, he retrieved his personal laptop from his car and locked himself in one of the unused interview rooms on the 3rd floor. The memory drive contained a single encrypted folder. Marcus wasn't a tech expert, but Alan Pritchard apparently hadn't been either. The password prompt accepted, Rachel 1989, on the second try. The sister's name and birth year. Sentimental, even in his paranoia. Inside were spreadsheets. Dozens of them, each more detailed than the last. Marcus opened the most recent file, dated the Thursday before Alan's death, and began to read. What Alan Pritchard had discovered was a shell game, elegant in its complexity. Meridian Financial Group, where Alan had worked, was a legitimate investment firm managing portfolios for high-net-worth clients. But nested within its corporate structure was Meridian Capital Partners, a private equity fund that operated with considerably less oversight. And within that fund, Alan had traced a pattern of transactions that didn't make economic sense unless you understood their real purpose. Money was flowing in from various sources, investment accounts, corporate holdings, real estate trusts, and then fragmenting through a network of subsidiary accounts before reconsolidating in offshore holdings. The amounts were staggering, 40 million here, 60 million there, sometimes more. But the paper trail made it look like legitimate investment activity, losses and gains that balanced out over quarterly reports. Except Alan had found the discrepancies. Small ones at first, decimal points that didn't quite align, transfers that happened on weekends when markets were closed, accounts that existed on paper but had no actual trading activity. He'd followed these threads obsessively, and they'd led him to something bigger. The fund wasn't just moving money. It was cleaning it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling the implications settle over him like cold water. This wasn't simple embezzlement or insider trading. This was infrastructure. Someone had built a machine for processing dirty money and disguising it as legitimate investment returns, and they'd hidden it inside a respected financial institution where analysts like Alan Pritchard were trusted to look the other way at small irregularities. But Alan hadn't looked away. The spreadsheets detailed transactions going back 3 years, maybe longer. Alan had even attempted to trace the money's origins, though his notes became speculative there. Possible sources: real estate fraud, political contributions needing laundering, corporate kickbacks. One notation, marked with 3 question marks, simply read, foreign. Government level. And then there were the names. Alan had compiled a list of people connected to Meridian Capital Partners, not just employees, but board members, silent partners, people whose names appeared on corporate filings and investment documents. Marcus recognized a few. Richard Harrison was a venture capitalist whose face appeared regularly in business publications. David Kellerman sat on the boards of 3 major banks. Linda Voss had been featured in a Forbes article about women in finance. But one name stopped Marcus cold: Thomas Gerard. He knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. Thomas Gerard was the deputy mayor, in charge of economic development. Before his political career, he'd worked in finance for 20 years. And according to Alan's documents, he was listed as a founding partner of Meridian Capital Partners, though his name had been carefully removed from recent filings. Marcus sat in the silence of the interview room, staring at that name on his screen. The deputy mayor. Someone with access to city contracts, development deals, millions in municipal funds flowing through projects he oversaw. He thought about Lieutenant Garrison delivering the file personally. About the case being marked conclusive so quickly. About the thin folder that should have been thicker for a financial analyst's suspicious death. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "Stop looking." Marcus stared at the message. 3 words. No context, no signature. He checked the number, a local area code, but when he tried calling it back, he got an automated message saying it was no longer in service. His heart was beating faster now. Someone was watching. Someone knew he'd gone to the apartment, knew he'd found something, knew enough to want him to stop. He should stop. The smart thing would be to close the laptop, delete everything, return the memory drive and phone to evidence with some plausible story about finding them during a follow-up search. Write his report, conclude suicide, move on to the next case. He had a daughter starting college next year. He had a pension to protect. 19 years of clean service. Instead, Marcus copied everything from the memory drive onto his laptop, then onto a second drive he kept in his desk. He photographed the most important pages. He wrote down the key names and dates in his personal notebook, the one he never submitted as evidence. Then he pulled out the burner phone from Alan's apartment and powered it on. One number in the call log, called 17 times over 4 weeks. Marcus dialed it, half expecting another automated message. It rang 3 times before someone answered. "Jesus Christ," a woman's voice said, sharp with panic. "I told you never to call this number again." "There. This isn't Alan," Marcus said quickly. "My name is Detective Marcus Webb. I'm investigating his death." Silence. He could hear her breathing, rapid and shallow. "Are you still there?" Marcus asked. "He's dead." Her voice was smaller now, fractured. "They said. I thought maybe he'd just run, gone somewhere safe, but he's actually." "Who are you?" Another long pause. Then, "My name is Jennifer Hale. I'm an attorney with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Alan came to me 6 weeks ago with evidence of securities fraud at Meridian Financial. We were building a case." She took a shaky breath. "And now he's dead, which means they know, which means I'm. Where are you right now?" "Somewhere safe. I can't tell you where. I need to talk to you. I need to understand what Alan found." "You don't understand," Jennifer said, and Marcus could hear something that sounded like fear or exhaustion or both. "The people involved in this, they're not just rich. They're connected at every level. Banks, city government, maybe higher." Alan thought he was being careful, thought he could gather enough evidence to force an investigation they couldn't bury. But you can't force anything when the people you're investigating are the same ones who decide what gets investigated. Marcus thought about Thomas Gerard. About Lieutenant Garrison's careful handling of the case. About the text message telling him to stop. "How high up does this go?" he asked. Jennifer laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Alan's last words to me were, 'It goes too high. We'll never reach them all.' He was right. And now you're asking the same questions he did, which means..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "I can protect you," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. "No," Jennifer said quietly. "You can't." Neither could he. "But maybe." She paused. "Maybe you can at least make sure people know why he died. Make sure it wasn't for nothing. Help me do that. Meet with me. I'll think about it. If I decide to, I'll call you." "But Detective Webb..." Her voice hardened slightly. "Be very careful who you trust with this. Alan trusted the wrong people at the beginning, and that's probably what killed him." The line went dead. Marcus sat alone in the interview room, surrounded by evidence of corruption that reached into places he couldn't safely touch. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, indifferent to the small dramas of justice and truth playing out in its shadows. He looked at his phone, at that text message, "Stop looking." But Marcus Webb had been a detective for 19 years, and he'd never learned how to stop looking once he'd seen something wrong. Even when looking might cost him everything. Chapter 4, The Meeting That Changed Everything. Marcus spent the next 3 days in a careful dance between appearing to close the case and quietly pursuing it. He filed preliminary reports that suggested nothing suspicious, attended routine briefings, kept his head down. But every evening, he returned to that interview room on the 3rd floor and studied Alan Pritchard's evidence, committing names and transaction patterns to memory. Jennifer Hale didn't call. On Thursday morning, Lieutenant Garrison stopped by his desk. "How's the Pritchard case coming?" "Almost wrapped," Marcus said, keeping his tone neutral. "Just need to finalize a few details with the family." Garrison nodded, but his eyes lingered on Marcus's desk, scanning for the case file. "Good. We need to move it along. The sister's been calling the commissioner's office, making noise about a cover-up. You know how families get. I'll have it closed by Monday. Make it Friday. Garrison's voice carried an edge now. This isn't complicated, Webb. Man killed himself. Happens every day. Don't turn it into something it's not. After Garrison left, Marcus sat very still, feeling the message beneath the words. Close it. Move on. Don't ask questions. That afternoon, his personal phone rang. Unknown number. Detective Webb. Jennifer Hale's voice was quieter than before, tired. I've been thinking about what you said. About making sure Alan's death meant something. I'm listening. There's a parking garage on 7th Street, level 3, northwest corner. Tonight at 10. Come alone, and make sure you're not followed. She paused. And detective? If you're working with them, if this is some kind of setup, just know that I've already sent copies of everything to people outside the city. Insurance policy. So there's no point in. I'm not working with anyone, Marcus interrupted. I just want the truth. Then you're as naive as Alan was, she said softly. But okay. 10 o'clock. Northwest corner. The line went dead. Marcus spent the rest of the day working routine cases, forcing himself to act normal while his mind calculated angles and risks. At 7 p.m., he left the station through the main entrance, drove home through early evening traffic, parked in his usual spot. He microwaved dinner, watched the news, did everything he normally did. If someone was watching, and he had to assume someone was, they needed to see nothing unusual. At 9:30, he left through his back door, walked 3 blocks to a convenience store, and called a cab using the store's phone. He had the driver drop him 6 blocks from the 7th Street garage, then walked the rest of the way, doubling back twice to check for tails. The parking garage was one of those old municipal structures, poorly lit and mostly empty after business hours. Marcus took the stairs to level 3, his footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. The northwest corner was dark, filled with shadows that could hide anything. Jennifer Hale was already there, standing beside a Honda Civic, arms crossed against the October cold. She was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that had seen too much too quickly. You came alone? She asked. Yes. Did you? She nodded toward the Civic. Everything Alan gave me is in there. Documents, recordings, analysis. Enough to bring down Meridian Capital Partners and maybe 3 other financial institutions. She looked at him directly. But it won't matter. Why not? Because 2 days after Alan died, I was approached by a man named Carlton Rhodes. He works for a law firm that represents half the banking industry. He offered me a choice: drop the investigation and accept a very generous position with a firm in Singapore, or continue pursuing it and watch my career, my reputation, and possibly my life get destroyed. She laughed bitterly. He had details, detective. He knew about my student loans, my mother's medical bills, exactly which pressure points to press. And he made it clear that what happened to Alan could happen to me. You could go to the FBI. This is beyond local jurisdiction. The FBI. Jennifer's voice rose slightly. Thomas Gerard, the deputy mayor, is married to Sandra Gerard, who sits on the Federal Reserve Board. David Kellerman's brother is a federal prosecutor. These people have connections everywhere. Alan and I thought we were being so careful, following every legal procedure, but they knew about our investigation before we even filed preliminary paperwork. She pulled a folder from her car. This is what Alan died for. Proof of systematic money laundering involving at least $2 billion over 3 years. And it won't see the inside of a courtroom because the people we'd need to prosecute it are the same people who control the system. Marcus took the folder, feeling its weight. Inside were copies of bank statements, transfer records, emails, enough evidence to end careers and start criminal trials. Under normal circumstances. "So what do you want from me?" he asked. "I want you to know the truth. I want someone in the system to understand what Alan found and why it mattered. Because I'm taking that job in Singapore. I'm leaving next week. And when I go, this investigation dies with Alan." Her eyes were wet now, but her voice stayed steady. He believed in justice, Detective Webb. He believed that if you found the truth and documented it carefully enough, the system would work. He was wrong. The system only works when it's convenient for the people who run it. Marcus looked at the documents in his hands. "There has to be something we can do." "There isn't. I've spent 3 weeks trying to find a way forward, and every path leads to a wall. The U.S. attorney won't touch it without FBI involvement. The FBI won't investigate without authorization from justice. And justice won't authorize anything that might embarrass people connected to the current administration." She wiped her eyes roughly. "Alan figured this out the weekend before he died. He called me Saturday night, said he finally understood. The case reached too high up. There was no one left to appeal to." "You think they killed him?" "I think he killed himself." Jennifer's voice was flat now, matter of fact. "I think he realized he'd spent 8 months building a case that would never see justice, and he couldn't live with that. Because if they'd killed him, they would have made it look like an accident, not suicide. They let it look like suicide because it sends a message: we broke him. We made him give up. That's more effective than murder." Marcus felt something cold settling in his chest. "So this is it. We just let them win." "They've already won, Detective. They won when they built a financial system where this kind of corruption is so embedded that exposing it would crash markets and destroy pension funds and wipe out savings accounts. They won when they made themselves too connected to prosecute. They won when they made the truth too expensive to pursue." She closed her car door. "I'm sorry. I thought maybe you'd be different, that maybe someone in law enforcement would care enough to fight anyway. But I can see it in your face. You're calculating the cost, just like I did. Just like Alan did at the end." She was right. Marcus was calculating. His daughter's tuition. His pension. His safety. The weight of going up against people who could destroy him with a phone call. "What would you do?" he asked quietly. "If you were me?" Jennifer looked at him for a long moment. "I'd go home. I'd write a report concluding suicide. I'd close the case and move on to something I could actually solve. Because fighting this will destroy you, and it won't change anything. That's what I'm doing. That's what any reasonable person would do." She got in her car, started the engine. "But Alan wasn't reasonable," she said through the window. "And maybe that's why I loved him." Marcus watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing down the garage ramp. He stood alone in the shadows, holding evidence that proved corruption at the highest levels, corruption that would never be prosecuted because the people responsible were too powerful to touch. His phone buzzed. Another text from an unknown number: "Smart choice, Detective. Close the case." They'd been watching. They knew about the meeting. They probably knew everything. Marcus looked at the folder in his hands, then at his phone. 2 paths stretched before him: safety or truth. Survival or justice. The smart choice or the right one. He thought about Alan Pritchard, sitting at his desk that Sunday night, facing the same choice. And he thought he understood now what Alan had felt in those final hours: not despair, exactly, but a terrible clarity about how the world actually worked. The garage was silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Marcus Webb stood at the crossroads of his life, knowing that whatever he chose next would define everything that came after. And for the first time in 19 years, he wasn't sure which choice he could live with. Chapter 5, The Report That Said Everything and Nothing. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table until dawn, the folder Jennifer had given him spread before him, reading and rereading the evidence of crimes that would never be prosecuted. At some point, He made coffee. At some point, the sky began to lighten. Time passed in a strange, disconnected way. At 7 a.m. Friday morning, he showered, dressed, and drove to the station. He nodded to colleagues in the hallway, poured coffee he didn't drink, sat at his desk like it was any other day. The folder from Jennifer stayed in his car, hidden under the spare tire. But the memory drive was in his pocket, small and solid against his chest. Lieutenant Garrison appeared at 8:30. Report ready? Almost. End of day. Make it noon. Commissioner wants this closed before the weekend. Marcus spent the morning writing. Not the report he was supposed to write, that one was already done, a neat conclusion of suicide with references to Alan's recent stress and the sister's understandable but misguided concerns. Instead, he wrote something else. A detailed summary of Alan Pritchard's investigation, complete with names, dates, transaction patterns, and connections. 20 pages that laid out the entire conspiracy in clear, irrefutable terms. He included everything except the location of his sources. Jennifer Hale's name didn't appear anywhere. Neither did any reference to the SEC investigation. If they came after him for this, they would find no path to anyone else. At 11:30, he printed 3 copies. One went into an envelope addressed to Rachel Pritchard in Baltimore. One went into a safety deposit box at a bank across town, a box he'd opened that morning under a false name. The third he folded into his jacket pocket. Then he wrote the official report. Suicide, case closed, condolences to the family. He signed it, dated it, and walked it to Garrison's office at exactly noon. Good, Garrison said, barely glancing at it. I'll process it this afternoon. Marcus returned to his desk and began working on other cases. Traffic accident on Highland Avenue. Robbery at a convenience store. Domestic dispute requiring follow-up. Normal work. Normal Friday. His phone rang at 2 p.m. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Detective Webb. A man's voice, smooth and professional. My name is Carlton Rhodes. I represent certain parties who appreciate your discretion regarding the Pritchard matter. Marcus said nothing. We understand you've been thorough in your investigation, Rhodes continued. Very thorough. But also sensible in your conclusions. That's the mark of an experienced detective, knowing when to pursue justice and when to recognize the limitations of the possible. I closed the case according to the evidence, Marcus said carefully. Of course. And we want you to know that your professionalism hasn't gone unnoticed. There's a position opening up in the Major Crimes Division next month. Captain Reeves is retiring. The selection committee has been asked to give your application serious consideration. A promotion. They were offering him a promotion for looking away. I appreciate that, Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral. We all serve the system in different ways, detective. You've served it well. Continue to do so, and you'll find yourself on a very promising career path. Rhodes paused. But of course, if certain documents were to surface, if certain unfounded allegations were to be made public, that would reflect very poorly on your judgment. We'd have to question whether someone who chases conspiracy theories is suited for higher responsibility. The threat was polite but clear. Stay quiet, get promoted. Speak up, get destroyed. I understand, Marcus said. I'm glad we could have this conversation. Enjoy your weekend, detective. The line went dead. Marcus sat at his desk, watching his colleagues work, listening to the familiar sounds of the station, phones ringing, conversations echoing, the machinery of justice grinding forward on cases that mattered to people who had no powerful friends protecting them. At 5 p.m., he left the building. He drove to the post office and mailed the envelope to Rachel Pritchard. She deserved to know her brother hadn't been crazy, hadn't given up for no reason. She deserved to understand what he'd found, even if nothing would ever be done about it. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink, thinking about choices and consequences. He could go to the media with his copy of the report, but Carlton Rhodes had been right. It would look like conspiracy theory, unfounded allegations from a detective with no proof that would hold up in court. The evidence was real, but evidence didn't matter if no one with power wanted to see it. He could push forward anyway, make noise, force investigations that would be quietly buried. But that would only destroy him while changing nothing. Alan Pritchard had already proven that truth without power was just noise in the wind. Or he could do what Jennifer Hale had done. Take the promotion, keep the evidence safe, wait for a moment when the political landscape shifted enough that someone might actually listen. Survive to fight another day, even if another day never came. Marcus Webb had been a detective for 19 years. He'd always believed that patient work and thorough documentation eventually led to justice. He believed in the system, in the idea that truth mattered more than power. Alan Pritchard had believed that too. And Alan Pritchard was dead. On Monday morning, Marcus returned to work. He investigated a burglary, took statements on an assault, filed reports that would lead to arrests and convictions. Small cases, the kind where justice was still possible because no one powerful cared enough to prevent it. He never spoke about Alan Pritchard again. The official file remained closed. Rachel Pritchard stopped calling the commissioner's office. Marcus never knew if she'd received his envelope, never tried to find out. Jennifer Hale moved to Singapore and disappeared from public record. 3 months later, Marcus was promoted to major crimes. He accepted the position, shook hands with people who'd orchestrated the cover-up, gave interviews about his commitment to serving the public. He did good work in his new role, solved important cases, earned commendations. But late at night, sometimes, he would take out that third copy of his report and read it, reminding himself of what he'd found and what he'd chosen not to do about it. The names were still there: Gerard, Kellerman, Voss, Harrison. Still in power, still protected, still untouchable. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. Justice had been served to those who couldn't afford to prevent it. And the truth about Alan Pritchard's death remained filed away in places no one would ever look, known by people who understood that knowing changed nothing. Years later, long after Marcus Webb retired with full pension and honors, long after Thomas Gerard became mayor and David Kellerman was appointed to a federal judgeship, a young journalist would stumble across references to an investigation that never happened. She would dig, ask questions, chase leads that went nowhere. And eventually, she would meet an old detective who would tell her, off the record, about a case that had reached too high up. But even then, Marcus would not give her the evidence. Because he'd learned what Alan Pritchard had learned, what every detective eventually learned who worked long enough: some truths were too expensive to pursue, some cases too dangerous to solve, and justice was only available to people who couldn't afford to prevent it. The system protected itself. It always had. It always would. And Detective Marcus Webb had learned to live with that, the way everyone who survived in the system learned to live with it. Not happily. Not proudly. But practically, with the quiet resignation of someone who'd seen how the world actually worked and chosen to stay in it anyway. In the end, that was the real tragedy. Not that Alan Pritchard had died, but that his death had changed nothing. The case had reached too high up, and the people at those heights remained forever beyond reach, protected by the same institutions that pretended to pursue justice for everyone else. Some cases, Marcus Webb had learned, weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to teach you the limits of what was possible, and what you were willing to sacrifice in a world where power always trumped truth. Alan Pritchard had learned that lesson too late. Marcus Webb had learned it just in time. And the city continued its endless rhythm, indifferent to both their stories, justice for some and silence for others, the way it had always been and would always be.